Nell Daly is the social worker turned venture capitalist. You are quoted for saying every entrepreneur has a revenge story. Do you have a revenge story?
Yes. It started with like the Tyra show, Entertainment Tonight, CNN, and then I ended up being on Fox, starting to get quite a few death threats. And my mom started to get very ill. I said, I'm going to back off TV. I would lie in bed at night going, what am I going to do about this? I've got to peace out. And that's what the system does to accomplish the next set of goals that I have, which is to go into venture capital. I have to just be so laser focused. Ambition in itself is inconvenient being a fund for the people. I cannot find money for women here. Women in particular in the UK last year got less than 2% of funding. I was like, where is this money? I called on 248 venture firms. And I privately WhatsApped him and I said, is there any way you could have lunch with me? I'm here because I need introductions. Oh my God, this is a moment. And I basically said, I need $10 million. He called me the next day and said, I'll give you $10 million. There's the plan and the secret plan. It's a really weird thing to be a psychotherapist. You have to tap into the spiritual side of who people are. I think women breathing is an act of protest. What do you do with adversity? Let's face it, like if you don't get to fulfill your dreams, that eats at your soul.
Nell Daly is the social worker turned venture capitalist and co-founder of the sector-agnostic Global Impact Fund with 50 million to invest in overlooked founders and their disruptive ideas. She classes herself as an advocate for the underdogs and works with policymakers for a fairer world. Nell, my absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
She's actually just flown in from New York.
Yeah.
Very jealous. She doesn't have any jet lag. Amazing. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you.
Let's kick off with Revenge Capital, your investment thesis. Tell us more about what you're looking for.
We are looking to invest in founders that have been traditionally overlooked, but we're truly inclusive. So I always say if like two bros come to me with a great idea that has impact, I'll say yes to it if I think it's a good idea and it's solving a major issue that we're facing, because I want to be totally inclusive. I don't want to exclude anybody.
Amazing. So can you give us a bit more detail on how you're defining overlooked?
People who are not well networked, who haven't had the ability to raise capital in the past. So let's talk about women. Let's talk about the disabled community, LGBTQIA+. We like to look at founders who are, and I'm not strict about this guideline, but who are younger and older. So people who are under the age of 25 or perhaps over 50, which I'm approaching at this point. Wow. Thank you. Thank you. And am I forgetting anybody? The BIPOC community, which we say BIPOC in the US, but the BAME community here. Yeah. So those are sort of the general overarching groups.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Amazing. So you've recently announced this. What was the official, I think it was the official launch date, your birthday?
Yes, it was.
What date was that?
Yeah, December 2nd.
Wow, incredible.
Yeah.
So I'm so genuinely curious. How did you set up your fund? How did you secure that 50 million? Congratulations.
Thank you.
You know, again, you're not from that world of finance. You're not the Mayor Pale and Stale. Like, where do you begin?
And the Mail Pale and Stale. That is such a good one. I haven't heard that one before. Yeah, that's awesome. That's a good one. So do you want to know the story? Let's tell stories. Let's tell stories. Stories are always the most interesting things to hear. So yeah, I was in the UK and it was a year ago and I was searching for money for a beauty founder. I really believed in her product. I still do. And I flew over to the UK on my own to sort of do a tour of venture capital groups. Even as somebody who had already been in the space, because this is technically a second fund for me, it's not my first fund. And I can tell you about my other endeavor before I did Revenge. That kind of got my feet wet in the space before I launched my own fund. I was over here and I could not raise capital in the UK for her. I was like, where is this money? I called on 248 venture firms, high net worth individuals or family offices, by creating Excel spreadsheets. And are we allowed to swear on this podcast? Are you clean? It's okay. It's okay. Are you sure? I'm like asking you on the fly. So it's just much more efficient if I'm myself. So yeah. So I was on PitchBook and I create spreadsheets. Like I don't think that there's like some sort of magic to this. People make you think there is, but I literally got on PitchBook. And for those of you who don't know PitchBook is software that a lot of investment banks use or people can use to look at who invests in deals. It's just software. It's very, very easy to use. It kind of can be expensive. I had a subscription to it through somebody I knew. And so I was on PitchBook and I looked up lists of venture capital groups that invested in beauty. I couldn't find anybody after calling everybody to see who invests in the beauty space still in the UK in particular. So US venture capital firms typically won't make investments across border, especially early on. And there's various reasons for that. So the pool of capital is much smaller in the UK that you can dip into. And I had been trying. It was exhausting. And I thought, I know the climate's changed from 2 years before that, but why is this so hard? So I came over and I started trying to meet with venture firms actually and say, like, what are you investing in? I would take detailed notes on these spreadsheets, right? Like, this is their mandate. This is what they're looking for. This is their investment thesis. This is the checks that they write out. And through another deal that I was working on, there was a guy sitting at a table, and a few months before that, and I privately WhatsApped him and I said, "Is there any way you could have lunch with me?" Because I was having trouble getting meetings with some of those venture firms and thought this guy might be able to help get me into one. He said, "Of course, I'll have breakfast with you," very polite. And through that breakfast, during it, I said, "I'm here because I need introductions into a certain amount of venture firms. Assuming he's a tax accountant, would you be able to help me? You might know somebody there." And he said, "Which one?" And I said, "One particular." And he said, "I started that 30 years ago."
Wow.
And then he said, "Nell, what do you need? Why are we having breakfast?" And immediately I had to switch into, oh my God, this is a moment that I could take. And I basically said, "I need $10 million else I'm leaving the UK." I said, "I cannot find money for women here." And I've gone to syndicate groups and angel groups, and they're mostly just investing in tech. I can't see where they're looking at consumer. I don't even really see it. Like it was very hard for me to find as an outsider. And I was sort of using my journalist hat to do research on the space. And he called me the next day and said, "I'll give you your 10 million." I essentially said, and this is not a slight to the UK at all, because part of my home is here now and my heart is very much here, is that I could do more business in New York and Miami and LA in a day than I was being able to do in the UK. Yeah, and I feel badly saying that, but then after sort of raising the fund and getting it secured, and then it ended up, now it's a $50 million fund with money for follow-on capital, and we set up the documentation to do fund 2 already, which will be institutional capital, because so many people came to us and said, "Wow, you're doing this. Can we come on?" And we wanted to keep fund 1 private and fund 2 will be institutional. That starting to do sort of deeper research into the space, I realized that women in particular in the UK last year got less than 2% of funding.
We were all kind of blue in the face with like repeating the same sort of statistics over and over. And
By the way, it's not much better in the US.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, that it's double. But like, what are we saying here? And I think, yeah. And I was at the House of Lords yesterday. I think, was it yesterday? Yeah. They did a meeting about the Women's Initiative that they're kind of starting to roll out, which is very interesting. Yeah. And we can talk more in depth about that, because I've actually learned quite a bit and had a nice call with Debbie about it. But what's interesting there is that, you sort of look at what's happening in the UK and you think, how much forward movement has there been over the last 10 years? And the same is happening in the US, that we're all kind of like beating the same drum, but what's really going on here?
And I think you are so uniquely qualified to actually comment on the state of both the US and the UK, having your direct experience and doing the same kind of work in both places. I'm not at all surprised to hear it. You beat me to the punch on that story, because I did my research and I was going to ask you about that one particular breakfast meeting that changed everything. So I love how these things happen. I think it's also testament to getting out there, networking. I loved also how you mentioned putting on your journalistic hat and having that sort of researcher and just being a detective and finding stuff out and information gathering. Did you feel like you needed that first validation, that first person to say yes, to then kind of open the floodgates to everything else? Was that kind of a real validation that everyone else needed to have, or was it just simply like, right, okay, we're snowballing now?
The fund is just one LP, so I didn't have to go out and source more capital on the back of that. I've had to do that in previous deals before. In this particular case, that's not the case. And when we start to go for institutional, depending on how big we want a fund to be, an institution could come in for quite a bit of money, or we might have to pair a couple of institutions together to raise fund 2. Make no mistake, and I'm a huge believer in A, saying things out to the universe, and B, even more, writing things on a piece of paper. And I think you have to be very careful what you write on a piece of paper. It's like, be careful what you ask for, because that shit comes true. And it might not come true on your timeline. Like, the universe might have a different timeline for it. But as a psychotherapist, I saw this over 12 years of sitting with people and listening to their life stories, how things played out.
Do you have a crazy instance of that where you've written something?
Oh, 100%.
What's a crazy 100%. One you can share now?
Oh, God. One's very personal. Yeah, I mean, just the fund in general. Yeah.
You wrote that down?
Oh, 100%.
Did you go into specifics with like 50 million or?
I didn't necessarily put a money number on it, although I did put a money number on a book deal that I want. And I'm very curious to see how that's going to go out. And I wrote that 5 years ago on a piece of paper. And that book deal didn't kind of come in to play at that point, but I have a feeling coming up there will be one. And I'm curious to see what the number will end up being on that. But I have found it with kind of everything if you write it down. And I believe I was listening to the founder of Spanx recently, and she gave a graduation speech. And again, I haven't gone back to the original study that was done, but Harvard did a study many years ago, and they looked at a class, and those that wrote down their goals were the top 5%. Have you heard about that? Which I thought was really, and I think I recently heard from my business partner, Andrew, that Jeff Bezos is in that cohort of who was studied. Yes. Yeah. And there was one group that actually wrote down what their goals were. Yeah. And they were like the 5% most successful in that cohort. Yeah.
What do you think the explanation is behind that? Like, how do you rationalize?
I can't, except like I think there must be some sort, I mean, we could get so woo-woo here, and I'm not opposed to doing that. And I can tell you, yeah, I mean, I think it's a really weird thing to be a psychotherapist, because you're sitting in people's souls day in and day out. You're like, it's soul work. And so you kind of have to tap into the spiritual, not kind of, you do. You have to tap into the spiritual side of who people are. You're dealing with grief. You're dealing with loss. You're dealing with transition. You're dealing with people's deeply personal symptoms that they're facing. And we can talk about mental health too, in terms of entrepreneurship and what that means for women in business or people who have been traditionally marginalized. Because let's face it, like, if you don't get to fulfill your dreams, that eats at your soul. And that is really probably at the core of why I'm doing what I'm doing. But I think that I had the unique perspective of, again, watching people manifest or not manifest things in their life. And I think those people who kind of have a clear direction when they write it down. And I haven't always known like the exact vision, but I think if you just write it down, there's some sort of like natural alignment that you're moving towards it in a different way. And I also just believe that the more you speak it, the more you believe it, then the more people around you believe it. And then the more that the collective energy sort of supports that work, and the tide rises to you. Yeah. As opposed to you just like swimming wherever it takes you.
Unsurprisingly, what struck me listening to you there is the feminine intelligence and the feminine energy, which is just, you are clearly such an outlier with what you've achieved and this fund. You're operating in this male-dominated space, but it's really refreshing, and much needed to hear this more. And by feminine energy, I don't mean obviously linked purely to being a woman. We've all got the masculine and feminine energies, but
the intuitive side,
right? Yeah. All of that. You talk about soul, the intuition, and the manifestation piece. That can go one of either way. You can either go woo-woo, which is sort of where you're leaning towards. I know the neuroscience that backs it up. I know the focus, kind of, it's the same thing, right? Coming up from different angles, but just how it focuses the mind. If we can try and unpack and break down, like, what were the ingredients that have helped you get to where you are now?
There's a few things. I will say that there's always, I don't really believe in a work-life balance at all. I believe that if you find something you're passionate about, it doesn't feel like work. And I'm sorry, that sounds so corny, but I am hugely driven by being intellectually stimulated. And I have an insatiable level of curiosity. And not everybody does. And I can't tell you how many times I sat at my desk and go like, die, ambition, die. Because ambition in itself is inconvenient. It's very inconvenient. Yes. Am I ever going to be satisfied? And it can be very inconvenient to your personal life, to motherhood, right? To the people who don't believe in you. It's like very irritating, right?
So
Who want you to
irritating.
like stay in a box and like not evolve as a human being. You know, and so like if we were to really have a heartfelt conversation, like let's talk about like how women's ambition can like destroy family relationships or, you know, cause a lot of friction in society. I think women breathing is an act of protest, to be honest, and especially in certain countries, right? We know that now. So I think that it's having that curiosity. I have a lot of drive. So I think if you had asked me a year ago or 2 years ago, I'd be like, oh, I don't know, maybe like a more meek answer. But the reality is I've like worked my ass off for this. But I honestly feel like the cause needs more leaders. And I've crossed that age gap where now you can kind of go back into the community as an elder and say, like, no, I can do this. And I can make sure that we can secure a better future for our children, essentially. So it's working around the clock, it's curiosity. And I think the other piece of this that's so important is the openness to networking. Like, if I could give one piece of advice, and I think, and I could get crucified for saying this, I don't want to get canceled for saying it. But in the UK, I have found that the women are much more open to networking than men, just naturally. They share their contacts more openly. They're free with it. They're like, let's meet for coffee. Let's meet for lunch. There's just and I think that comes from like, there's a need, right? Like our backs up are against the wall. If like you want to make something happen, you're going to have to like go out there and actually make connections and like see how you can open up a pathway forward. Where I have found in other circumstances with generally European men and UK men, it's more difficult. Where in the US, if you go to like the Bitcoin conference in Miami, if you go into any conferences in like California, Silicon Valley, LA, you know, Chicago, San Diego, everyone's exchanging cards. There's just like a level of general enthusiasm that I think, you know, when I meet Brits, generally they're like, what the fuck? Like her light, like what is she? Is she on something? And sometimes I'm in a restaurant here and I actually have to tone I have to tone it down, right?
I mean, there is this, whenever we go on holiday, especially within Europe, there's one loud voice we can
It's
hear.
an American.
It's often in an American accent.
Yeah, I hear it too. Yeah, I'm in line at the airport going, oh my God, really? It's so embarrassing. Yeah.
You mentioned saying kind of like, oh, a couple of years ago, you might have given a bit more of like a meek answer. We touched on just before we started rolling, you having exploded onto the scene seemingly out of nowhere. You went dark for 5 years. So what happened there?
Two things happened coincidentally. So I have a master's in fine art and creative writing from Columbia. And I only talk about this because they have a very good journalism school. So some of what you do is in the journalism space. And I always toyed with, do I want the MFA so I could teach on the college level? I had to literally pull myself out of academia. I'm very academically minded and love academia. I could study. I could have like 1,000 degrees. I could sit in a library all day long. So I decided to get my MFA, and then I got a teaching job at NYU. And when I was at NYU teaching writing, I ended up doing my MSW in social work. There was a decision I had to make whether I was going to try to go back to do a post-bac to do medicine and become a doctor, or do something that was slightly less intensive. I wanted to start to have a family, so it wasn't really going to work out. So I did my MSW. And I naturally took those two disciplines. And as I knew people in New York, they would say, can you commentate on the networks for us? So it started with like the Tyra show, and then it led to Entertainment Tonight, and then it led to CNN, and then I ended up being on Fox quite a bit. Fox was really interesting for me because I'm much more of I would say like a British journalist, where I just believe in reporting the facts, not necessarily on commentating like you do in cable news in the States, which by the way is illegal here. You guys don't have this. We have this whole thing called cable news. And I really liked it because people would naturally think that I'm very progressive. I'm actually an independent. So in the Revenge, the fund is a nonpartisan organization. We don't align with either party, whether it's in the UK or in the US or globally. We will take conservative founders and we'll take liberal founders. Like we do not discriminate. That's the whole premise of Revenge, right? It's a non-discriminatory fund. So I started doing a lot of television on Fox, which I thought was cool because you could kind of slip in this different sort of messaging. And I wasn't afraid to have nuanced debate. And I really like that about myself. I like the fact that as a psychotherapist, you're incredibly tolerant of people's opinions. You're incredibly tolerant about the way they choose to live their life. You know, in the Times article, I talk about learning to sweat down my back. There's things I had heard in my office for 10 years that were like, I didn't even know people could do. Let's talk about like sex parties or things that, I started when I was pretty green in New York. And you heard all kinds of stories and some that you might actually like have a problem with, but you don't show that because you're holding space for someone to experience their own story in front of you, and you're there just to listen and to help sort of put the pieces on a table together of their story so they can make sense of it. Yeah. And so I started doing Fox, and with that, no matter what I said, what they do on Fox is on cable news, they have a bunch of younger uh, people in production writing the tickers underneath what you're saying. And it's very effective. So sometimes the tickers don't even match what the host is saying, but they're a bit inflammatory. And it can happen on any network, any cable news show, any actual show in particular. And I ended up starting to get quite a few death threats from doing that.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah.
because of the inflammatory.
It just, because that's how you sell, right? That's how you sell. You get the ratings up. It's contentious. It seems contentious, even if it's not a contentious conversation. I was sort of there to be the counterpoint generally on most stories, even if there was no counterpoint, even if I was just reporting on sort of legislation that came through about the LGBTQIA community. And yeah, I started getting quite a few death threats. This was when Trump was starting to run for his first presidency, and they were generally around sexual violence. So many times when women are threatened, privately, in these cases, it has to do with, pretty violent crimes. And it makes you take a step back, and it's quite effective in silencing someone, because as a woman, as a single mom, I had 3 kids, and my mother at the time had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. So I was living with my mother, and I would lie in bed at night going, oh my God, I've just been on Fox. These things are coming through my phone, my feeds, my social feeds. What would I do? And so you can put yourself on the radar of the local police, and you can call the authorities that you need to and report it. But ultimately, you're incredibly vulnerable as a woman. And so at a certain point, when my mom started to get very ill, I said, I'm going to back off TV. I didn't know at that point that I would back off completely from social media, because I had spent quite a bit of time sort of building community and believed in it and believed in the profile and the messaging that you could do through social media. When she passed away, I really honed in and said to myself, to accomplish the next set of goals that I have, which is to go into venture capital, I have to just be so laser focused. And so many women, so many people know that social media, as much as it's crucial, is also a massive time suck. Yeah. And it can cause an enormous financial burden to people, especially fledgling entrepreneurs. And so I just cut out the fat. Like anything that I felt like was going to detract me from doing what I needed to do to accomplish this fund, I was just going to let it go. So I got really zoned in on that. And if you ask me one regret, there's probably a bit of regret that I didn't go back to it earlier, because I do believe in the power of a personal brand and continuing personal messaging. And I miss the people that I had in the community, and I had built some really great things that you sort of let die. But on the other hand, it worked out.
It did work out. I was going to say,
yeah.
I mean, don't have too much regret on that, because you have made a splash, and the people who are hanging out, that like they're still there, and you've made this huge comeback, and I think you're more than making up for it now with the press and everything else. Now, what a crazy story. I was not expecting any of that. Yeah. How gut-wrenching. Just going back to just these death threats, I'm so curious, especially with your psychotherapy background. How did you mentally and emotionally cope with that?
You know, what was unfortunate about it is that I didn't have, I think if you're a woman in journalism, you probably have other journalists just naturally in your network that you can call and talk to, and there's support, whether it's through the network or through CNN. For some reason, I really internalized it. And I was quiet. Like I didn't reach out to anybody and say, like the producers knew it was happening because they would see my phone blow up the minute I finished, being on air. they would see it start to happen. But I never reached out. I never said like, I just don't even think it occurred. Yeah, yeah. And I have 3 kids, and like you leave the studio, and the next thing you know, you're in a car and you're heading home, and you're making, hot dogs and hamburgers for your kids, and you're answering phone calls for clients, and you're working on other things. So I think I just sort of parked it, and it would be late at night when you'd sit there looking at the ceiling, and I ended up getting a taser flashlight. I never got a gun, which we can have in the US. I was too afraid to have a gun in the house. And I also did a lot of psychotherapy for people who were part of the Sandy Hook tragedy. So we could have a whole nother podcast on guns in America. For the listeners who don't know, Sandy Hook was a tragedy that happened where a middle school boy went into an elementary school in the state of Connecticut, where I'm from and live near, and killed quite a few children and teachers and school administrators. Uh, I can't remember the exact date when it happened, but about a decade ago now. And so I would lie in bed at night going, what am I going to do about this? And as much as you can alarm your your house, going out to your car, going to the grocery store, it only takes one. And to layer that, I'm a psychotherapist. So I know the fragility of someone's mental health deeply, right? Is what I did for a living for over a decade. So I was very conscious that this could be really tragic for people involved if the 1%, decided to act upon their impulse and do something to me. And so I said, until I'm better equipped to do something like that, I've got to peace out. And that's what the system does. Right. So like that is an exact kind of great case example of how misogyny in our society and chauvinism, can absolutely win, because they took a voice, by the way, that wasn't necessarily a voice that was conservative, which this would mostly happen when I was on Fox, not the other way. And they took it off air, which is a shame.
Kudos to you for bouncing back,
Thank
because
you.
I can only imagine. I just empathize with just how scary, just as a woman to begin with, as a mum on top of that, and the list goes on and on. The psychotherapy experience helps you. You've got the head as well as the heart going on as well. So it sounds so incredibly scary. And we need to pick ourselves back up again afterwards, right? We can only be silenced for so long. So coming back to revenge capital, how does your psychotherapist background make you a better investor?
Oh, that's such a good question. Yeah. How does that happen? I think that I'm so relationship driven, and our investment thesis is about investing in people. And I know that sounds so cheesy and people say it all the time, but I really think that an idea you can have a great idea, but you can be a terrible operator or a terrible human being, or you can be a great person and like not such a great operator. As a therapist, you have um, I don't want to make anybody feel like who comes in to pitch us an idea that I'm psychoanalyzing them at all, because you don't do that. Like, and that's like kept me back. Like, no one told me in school, like, people are going to be kind of afraid of you because they're going to think you're psychoanalyzing them. And by the way, like, it doesn't work that way. Like, when you're in practice, you're like deeply in practice. And when you're out of it, it's like, it's as dramatic as sort of like having a bathing suit on to go swimming and then like having all your clothes on and not by a pool, right? It's like a totally different scenario. So when people come in, I do think though that I have the ability to develop rapport pretty quickly with people, because that's what you do as a psychotherapist. You have to gain their trust, and you have to create a space where you're really listening to their story and you're taking it in and you're able to ask questions to really derive the information you need to be able to give a baseline of how somebody's doing. And so I think I can apply all that strategy to a founder that I'm working with, and I can teach my team how to do the same thing. So I think that that's probably the most helpful part of it. And I think also just having like a very strong passion about helping the underdog, about being a fund for the people. And that's not bullshit, right? Like, I've lived and breathed and eaten this for my entire career. When you go into social work, you work in populations that have gotten the short end of the stick. You work with, I started my career early in HIV/AIDS. I started working in, housing projects in Red Hook, Brooklyn. You start working with the poor, the disenfranchised, the traditionally marginalized, people who've gone through a lot because of just how they were born and the circumstances to which they find themselves that were totally out of their own control. And so to help those people, you really like, it's in the fiber of your being to hear someone's story and to say like, there's a moment here where we could really affect change with what this person is bringing to the table. And it doesn't mean that every person that we invest in has this like idea that's going to solve climate change, or we're not sort of a direct impact fund in that way. It's just, for me, I always say that there's the plan and the secret plan. The secret plan is to be able to make those people money so they can reinvest it back into their communities, you hope, or be able to strike a check to somebody who they care about to be a policymaker if they don't end up running for politics themselves.
Love that. That completely resonates. But there's research to back up, again, the case for female founders in particular, right?
Yeah, women, we need more leaders.
Yeah, the more millionaire women, the more economically empowered women, the better it is for the planet. The research has shown that we invest back into our communities, into charitable projects. So I totally get that and love the mission.
And I think that, in the case of women, one of the things that pisses me off, no, there's a lot, but one of the big things that pisses me off is that I cannot stand to see people in general, but women in particular, and especially women with children, in vulnerable positions because they're in toxic relationships with either men or bosses, and they can't get out of them because they don't have financial independence. And that full stop is probably at really the heart of my mission. And then that translates into anybody who's felt like they've had to kind of like take it because they didn't have the money to say, I want to walk away from this. This is not serving me anymore. Or it's actually very unhealthy for me. Very unhealthy for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Money is a tool. It gives you that optionality to walk away from situations that you need to get out of. And I think that the way that we have been socially conditioned and how money is still a taboo. I love talking about all this as well because it's all a farce. It's all a construct to keep out the others, the marginalized. So I'm fully behind your mission. I love it, absolutely support it.
Yeah, and we can play this game right now where what happens as a female founder or marginalized founder, but again, let's talk about gender because it's just an easy case example but how many times as a woman, and you've been in business before, you go into a meeting and you say, I really need X, Y, and Z in terms of money. And the person you're talking to, whether they're male or female, is conditioned to say, I think I have a cousin in Silicon Valley who has an aunt who invests in women. Let's flip the script. Just imagine a man going to a meeting and has somebody across the table saying to them, I think I know a guy who lives in Tennessee who might invest in men.
Yeah, it's so reductive. This is the bee in my bonnet as well, is how reductive this demographic. It's and as a marketeer formally as well, I've already got a bee in my bonnet around like demographics versus psychographics, and it's like set up a marketing campaign for like ABC1 demographic for like 18 to 35. It's so reductive to your point there. It's like I've been in situations where positively I've either won business pitches with my last agency or made it to the final rounds, and the client response on more than one occasion has been along the lines of, we wanted more kind of female voices, more kind of women involved. Even as an agency owner, like we wanted women involved, and it didn't sit right with me, and there was an immediate sort of repellent reaction to that, and I think after processing it for a bit, that's when I realized I had that light bulb moment where I was like, you're reducing me down to something so honestly uninteresting and irrelevant about me. The fact, like, my genitalia is like 1% of what makes up who I am and everything I can give to the world. So I totally get your point. But I think it's just a sad reflection of the current situation. You are quoted for saying every entrepreneur has a revenge story. Do you have a revenge story?
Yes. I have a revenge story every day. I was saying, I say all the time, like, give me the hour, give me the day. Like, there's something happening in my head where I'm like, oh, that person scorned me. I'm going to show them. And I think, listen, I mean, we could pick a million out of a hat, but I think that what's more interesting, and at some point, like, I could share a revenge story, but What's more interesting is like, what do you do with adversity? What do you do with it? Right? Like, do you just, do you, because I think the most dangerous thing, and I think if you ask me sort of like, what's the one tragedy that you experienced in your life that changed things? And one was my mother dying. And I can tell you, because I had a moment there when she died, like most of us do when someone we desperately love dies. But I think that, you know, you can decide if you're going to believe the bullshit people tell you about yourself. That's a tragedy, is to not be strong enough as a woman or as a human being to say, that doesn't sit right with me. There's something wrong about that. Or I feel that in my stomach, but the tragedy in my life has been when I believed the bullshit. And then I made decisions on the bullshit, as opposed to saying, you know what, thank you. And sometimes it's not even solicited, right? Their advice or their opinion is not even solicited. Thank you for saying that. And then you make your own decision and you follow your own gut and you double down on yourself and you make decisions based on what feels right for you. I think that is one of the biggest human tragedies and that any human being faces, and that's universal. We all do it, but it can really take you down a path that isn't the right path for you.
Yeah, absolutely preaching to the choir on that front. I 1,000% agree. I think, yes, there is, you can be victimized, but if you want to assume victimhood, I think there's that reminder that there is that choice. And again, it's what's that narrative that you're buying into, and how is that serving you?
I think let's do something really fun and British right now. Let's refer back to Shakespeare. So I studied a lot of Shakespeare. I was an English major in college. I love Shakespeare. And this is very, appropriate for being right here in London talking about you today. But um, so there's this moment in Othello, right? The one of the villainous character. I believe I'm getting this right, and forgive me because I'm speaking to a British audience, so I could be like crucifying myself here. I know, yeah, no, but there's Iago, and he's always whispering things in Othello's ear, and then Othello goes on to kill Desdemona, who he actually loves because he believes Iago. And I think that the best thing anybody can do for themselves, especially as they're trying to pursue a dream, because again, it is so important to say over and over again, and I don't think we talk about this enough, to be underemployed or underutilized in life is soul crushing. And we always talk about when people come in and they are depressed and anxious, so often psychotherapists aren't trained to be like, it's just like your general dream not being met. Like, what do you really feel like you were meant to do and you're not doing? And how does that eat away at you every single day? And so I think that learning how to identify who are the Yagos in your life and get the fuck away from them is like a huge life lesson. Just like cut them out, and sometimes that's so hard because sometimes that's actually family members who don't believe in you. And in my own case, I can tell you that there were people who have been very close to me in my own life who at times legitimately thought, like, what are you doing? I don't get it. I don't understand. Why can't you live like a more simple life? Like, why can't you do X? Why can't you do Y? And at some point, you have to decide, how much time and energy am I going to spend trying to convince people of who I am? Or am I just going to say, again, thank you for your opinion, and then make your own decision?
Work at it and let the results
Yeah, yeah.
You'll come back 5 years
Yeah,
later.
and maybe you don't. Like, I think that's also another thing that Americans are really good at, is we're really good at failing. Like, we're really good at failing and being like, oh shit, learning lesson, right? We don't lose our sense of humor generally about failing the way other cultures do. I mean, some cultures it's like a big deal to fail. I mean, like, they become, yeah, that historically they could commit suicide because they failed at something. It's tragic. Where I think Americans just have this like natural resilience and like, okay, that didn't work out, but like this can, or that kind of constant optimism is also really hopeful and nice to be around. And, if I can do anything to influence the companies that we end up investing in or the people around me, it's to keep them optimistic and hopeful, because there is so much to be hopeful for. And I think the tides are changing. If I can do this, oh my God, if I can do this, that's just like a testament to itself that other people can do this.
Amazing. Nell, so amazing to have you here on the show.
Thank you.
You beat me to the final traditional closing question, which was around one tragedy, and actually prefer to leave it on a high note anyway. Sure. How can people get in touch? Give us a bit more detail. Like, who do you want to hear from?
Yeah, well, we want to hear from anybody who has an idea. Absolutely. And even if you don't think that you fit into the cohort of who we're investing in, again, this is an inclusive fund. So again, I always say the example, like if two bros come to us with an idea, we will look at it. We'll look at everything that crosses our table. At least we're trying to. So we can, be reached at revenge.capital, which is our website. And you go into type form and you fill it out and you put in your pitch there. And we'll start doing a lot more activations around the UK as well to meet people and to get out of the London bubble, as they say, and hit other parts of the country. I want to look at Wales. I want to look at Scotland. I want to look at Ireland as well. Well, it's so funny you say that because I just think that's like natural. I actually know a guy in the US who his entire investment thesis, and he's an incredible record, and he won't look at any deals that are West Coast, East Coast. So he stays away from New York and he stays away from LA, San Francisco, Silicon Valley, and invests entirely in what's considered central US. And he's done very, very well because he's hitting people who don't, again, traditionally get easy access to funding, and he's making those ideas happen. So
contrarian. So as fantastic as it is that you look at everything, what's the decision-making process, at least to like get through the next sort of rounds? How are you going to filter through?
We have different criteria that we're starting to set out for that, right? So it has to feel, I think it has to feel, as I say to Charlotte, I was talking to her today, one of my coworkers, it has to feel like there's some sort of sexiness about it. Like, is there some sort of disruption? Like, what's the, like, do you want to ask it out again? Is there a there across the table? Whether like the founder just like amazes you, or their idea or what they've accomplished really like gets you going. And you'd be really proud to say like, this is a company that I'm investing in. So I think it's a gut thing to begin with. And then you do the due diligence, because a lot of people can sell you a story, and a lot of people will sell you a story, especially when they need money. And many of the things that we're seeing, like we'll look across all stages, not necessarily like really late stage, although we can find the financing for really late stage deals, which take like they're much more capital intensive. We're talking about like 50 million, 100 million plus. We do have money for follow-on capital. So we'll look at anything from the beginning of an idea to, I would say our sweet spot would be around Series A, where you're writing out checks for like, let's say $2 to $5 to $10 million.
Perfect. Can we translate any of those gut instinct heuristics to practical tips that founders can be like, yeah, I've got it, I'm going to send through my pitch deck, or maybe that's not quite for me?
Yeah, I think one of the things I would say to founders when they're sending their material through is just be really concise and really clear. Like, this is how much my company, don't try to hide anything, because we're going to find it. We're very sophisticated investors. We have a big team behind us who are looking at the due diligence, and that's not to scare anyone away. It's just like eventually we're going to ask the question that you're already trying to dodge. And I'll probably get to it a lot quicker than other people because I'm kind of like, no bullshit. Yeah, exactly. So I think just being really honest, just coming and saying like, this is how much I've made, this is how much I've spent trying to get the idea off the ground. This is where I think the company is going to go. Here's my P&L. Here are the actual numbers. And this is how much I'm looking to raise. And this is my valuation. I think that valuation is really interesting because they always kind of say it, and we generally don't hear very realistic valuations. And that's been a little bit disappointing as I've become a more seasoned investor. Because, and it's, by the way, I say that having also been on the other side of the table, having to negotiate these things with, I'm the one saying, here's our valuation, hoping the investor's going to invest in. So it's about being kind of really thorough in your research as to how you got to the valuation you got to, not just, I want to stick a big number on it because I don't want to give a lot of my company away.
Yeah. All right. So fantastic. Great practical tips. And now, are there any final words of wisdom you'd like to leave this episode on?
Oh my God, just keep going. Resilience, grit. Yeah, just please, like whatever, double down on yourself and keep going.
Thank you so much, Nell. And thank you so much for tuning in. Really hope that you've enjoyed this episode. If you haven't already, you know what to do. Please hit that subscribe button. It doesn't cost a thing. It takes 2 seconds. Really appreciate it. And I'll see you next time.